Hello, this is David Gauke, Chair of Negation and former Treasury Minister, and welcome to the latest in our Negotiating Government podcast. And I'm delighted once again to be joined by John Hall, former Treasury official, as we pick over another fiscal event, this time the November budget 2025 of Rachel Reeves, a much anticipated budget, it would be fair to say. We're going to talk a little bit about that and what it means for those who are negotiating with government. So, John, welcome. What was your high-level assessment of what the Chancellor was trying to achieve in her budget on the 26th of November?
It's an interesting one, dear, and I guess I would make three very general comments. The first is that by any measure, this was a big budget. It increases taxes by 26 billion. And coming on top of a 32 billion hike in taxes last year, this sets up this government to have the highest tax raising parliament that we've had in my lifetime. I mean, I think interestingly, coming on top of the last parliament, the UK is going to move from the tax burden being about 34% of GDP, which it's roughly been for the last few decades, to about 38% of GDP by the end of this one. So going from a sort of relatively low tax European economy to a medium to high tax economy. Now, this 5% increase in the national take national income for public spending and for tax is unprecedented. I mean, it is a huge shift in the balance between the public and the private sector. I guess the second thing I would say is it was big in the sense of a flurry of announcements. I think IFS calculated there were 75 new measures announced in this budget. So by any stretch of the imagination, this was a big budget. My second comment would be, despite that, actually in most of the discussions, both before the budget and after that, process has dominated content. And everybody's got very interested in the machinations of the dynamics between the OBR and Treasury, the role of managing expectations, whether the Chancellor was completely truthful in what she said. And in many senses, that has drowned out both the significance of the budget and what it was the Chancellor was trying to achieve. Which comes to my third point, which is for such a big budget, it was a bit underwhelming. And it's quite hard to work out what was the budget for. I mean, often when I worked in Treasury in the run-up to the budgets, Chancellors would be very clear about what the purpose of the budget for was. This is a budget for, or which group the budget was intended to help. It seems very much as though Rachel Reeves had two audiences in mind. Firstly, the bond markets, that she needed to do enough in terms of meeting her so-called ironclad fiscal rules to reassure them and allow interest rates to come down over the medium term. And secondly, to reassure the backbenchers that she was going to introduce policies that they would support. That leaves open the wider question, was it good for Britain? This ultimately became a fiscal repair job. And that's quite interesting because despite the pre-budget hype, the fiscal repair job wasn't needed because of huge swings in the underlying economic or fiscal forecasts for the OBR. In fact, the change that happened was very modest compared to any reasonable standard. It was a fiscal repair job because Rachel Reeves had left herself insufficient headroom against the fiscal rules in her budget last year. And as a result of that, has effectively been caught by events and has been responding to them instead of making the weather. What it wasn't was a budget for economic growth. And this worries me. And we can get on later whether it's appropriate to have a lot of economic measures announced in a budget as opposed to outside of it. But the UK has just downgraded its productivity forecast from 1.3% to 1%. That's against the reality of the moment where productivity basically hasn't grown in the last 3 years at all. So I'm not ruling out a further productivity downgrade at all. When I used to work in Treasury, we would look at, could we increase the trend rate of growth of the UK economy from about 2.5% to 3%? Over the rest of this parliament, it's going to be 1.5%. Current OBR forecasts are that there will be barely an increase in household disposable income by the end of the parliament. That's the second worst parliament on record. And the only one that was worse had a global pandemic in the middle of it. And yet this budget didn't do anything at all, which led to a higher rate of growth. We've actually downgraded the growth forecast. The government did do something to mitigate rises in the cost of living, but putting together both what happened before the budget and the budget measures, the inflation forecast is higher than it was in March, and inflation is going to be stickier. So my concerns on this is it was a huge budget, of course it was. The measures have been obscured by all the noise about process around it, but fundamentally there's questions about whether it was the budget that Britain needed or a survival budget for Rachel Reeves to get past the bond markets and the Labour backbenchers.
I think that's a fair categorisation of it, John. And it did seem to me that the Chancellor faced two immediate risks. One was, as you say, a bond market meltdown, and the other was a political meltdown from Labour MPs. And so the audience here, the audiences that mattered, weren't the general public, wasn't particularly the business community, but it was about the bond markets, which is why the headroom had to go up. Most of us would say the headroom did have to go up. £9.9 billion was far too low, and I think we've probably been critical of that in the past. And then it was Labour MPs, and Labour MPs did seem happy. Partly, I think there was this expectation management bit, so the fact that the basic rate of income tax hasn't gone up, that was a sigh of relief for Labour MPs, but they also positively welcomed the higher welfare spending. A lot of this is about, yes, it's the headroom, but also the reversal of the cuts to winter fuel payments, the disability benefit cuts, and now, of course, the abolition of the two-child benefit cap. And so those were sort of very Labour MP-friendly measures. And I wonder, so here's a theory for you, John, is that one of the reasons why they didn't get into much that could be described as kind of supply-side pro-growth measures is that quite a few of those might be controversial with Labour MPs. And I'm really struck that for a budget that didn't have much to say about growth, that we've had a couple of things since the budget that could very definitely be framed as being pro-business or pro-growth. The first is stepping back in the employment rights bill from the immediate right, or day one right to bring a claim for unfair dismissal that business was very concerned about. So that happened the day after. And then the Monday after the budget, we have the Prime Minister standing up, making a speech and very much endorsing the Fingleton review on nuclear power at commissioning, pointing out the ways in which we add costs to building nuclear power plants, and that there are ways in which we could reduce that because the regulatory regime is disproportionately stringent in some areas. It just sort of struck me as that you could have reframed this budget in a different way and made those announcements more the sort of centerpiece of what you're about, and saying here is a kind of pro-growth measure. And I'm sure it's political as to why they haven't done that. And I have to say I'm a bit concerned why they haven't done that, if they really are looking over their shoulders at Labour MPs to the extent that they are. But there is also a little sense, looking back on the budget and what is said subsequently, there's a little bit more hope here, a little bit more scope for optimism that there is a government that is engaging in the growth agenda than the impression that they left on the day of the budget. Is John, would you agree with that?
I mean, I'm the biggest fan in the world of avoiding budgets being machine gunned of lots of announcements, which then never get the light of day and can lead themselves to gimmicks as opposed to proper government strategies. And I think things which are really important, like the Fingleton review, probably do deserve their airtime. It's relatively unusual for the Chancellor not to use a formulation such as, and my right honourable friend will be coming forward with proposals over the next week. I mean, where the Fingleton review really struck home with me was on many of the things it said, which you've discussed, that we always like gold-plated bespoke designs rather than off-the-shelf modular approaches, that we like to design everything from scratch all the time, that anybody trying to take forward a project will have multiple regulators with overlapping responsibilities, that often the lack of a clear agenda, coupled with a degree of risk aversion, can mean not that we over-regulate, but that we regulate badly, so that we simply impose costs and delays without actually achieving very much. That may well be true of the nuclear industry, of which I'm not an expert. What really frightened me is if I deleted small modular reactors from the Fingleton report, it felt like it would be true of virtually every sector that we've looked at in recent years, whether it would be looking at hospital infrastructure, whether looking at HS2 or whatever. Many of the same things seem to apply within the UK.
It does strike me, and this is something for any industry that is negotiating with government and is wanting to remove some of the disproportionate regulatory burdens and so on. There might well be a possibility of kind of pointing to the Fingleton review and saying, look, this applies to our industry as well. Some of these problems here are not unique to nuclear energy. There is a wider application, and we should be talking to the government about ways in which we can use the lessons that have been learned on the narrow focus on nuclear energy and apply it elsewhere. Could that be a blueprint for reform more widely?
I think that's very important. I think we've established that the problems facing lots of sectors in a highly complex economy looking forward to the future and doing major developments are going to be common to those things which the Fingleton report have identified. I think one of the things we can take from the announcements which have been made since the budget is that the government is committed to growth, even if it didn't feature heavily within the budget statement itself. And there's probably two issues I would raise with that. The first is the UK has got a problem. This is a very low growth forecast period with no increase in household standard of living over the next 4 years effectively. Unless the government can crack that, it can't solve all of the other problems. And a lot of this fiscal repair work is because of the underlying problem, which is too slow growth has not been established. And the government, while it's doing many good things across the piece, has not yet done anything which is shifting the dial on that. Secondly, I think there are some positives we could take from the budget statement itself about the climate for business. A corporation tax roadmap was published last year, and the government has stuck to that. The government in the budget 2024 announced an unprecedented increase in capital investment funded by the public sector. It's going to be the highest level for several decades. And in the needing to make a fiscal retrenchment, there was no sign of that being rolled back on at all. But fundamentally, growth is going to come from individual decisions made by individual businesses in individual sectors, and they need to be solved on a sector-by-sector basis. And that's why I think there's an opportunity for business to go to government, make sure that the government understands the problem in that sector. And I think the Fingleton report and being able to point to that is a good way of saying it's not just them, it's here as well.
Yeah, I think that's, as I say, I think that's right. And it is fair to acknowledge that when it comes to a budget where they've raised £26 billion, they could have gone for measures that may have been politically easier, but more damaging from a sort of growth point of view. So they haven't particularly hit business hard. They haven't gone for the internationally mobile, who might go elsewhere. I can't resist making the point, of course, that that's what they did last year. So maybe they felt that they'd already done enough of that. But yes, to be fair to the government, there were some choices there which they could have made that I think would have been more damaging for the economy, and certainly that does suggest that they are keeping an eye on growth. So I don't want to be entirely dismissive of their aspirations there. And as I say, some of the stuff that we've heard since been much more focused on growth. Really, just to sort of point on the sort of the presentation. Don't want to get too detained by this, but yes, I agree with your point, John, you made earlier, that we could have. Sometimes you can have some positive announcements that get drowned out in a budget, but you can brief that before, announce it before the budget, or you could flag it up. And the fact that growth wasn't a theme of the Chancellor is striking. As I say, my own personal theory is that some of the things that go with growth would also antagonise Labour MPs, and that tells a story in its own right. So, John, one of the features of the budget is that the spending pressures are quite considerable in a number of areas that have been highlighted by the OBR. including things like special educational needs, issues with the NHS and pharmaceuticals, asylum accommodation, and so on. What sort of struck you about some of these pressures here, which essentially occur even though there's no policy change, but those pressures are increasing? What opportunities does that create, as well as challenges?
I think that's a really interesting point, David. I've been really surprised about how little attention is being paid to the spending implications of this budget. Before Rachel Reeves even stood up, there'd been an additional 20 billion of spending pressures identified, and that effectively completely consumed the increase in revenues, which was going to occur from the balance of the downgrade on productivity, which Rachel Reeves flagged up, and as indeed did the think tanks ahead of the budget, and the increase in the tax take because of higher inflation and changes in the composition of growth, which both she and all the think tanks seem to miss. And these are the 20 billion of increased spending without any policy change at all. Some of that was debt interest, higher debt interest because of higher interest rates. Quite a big chunk of it was higher benefit payments as a combination of higher inflation, because most benefits are indexed in line with inflation, but also a continuing increase in the number of claimants and the caseload that we're getting on health-related benefits. Thirdly, on send, as you say, with a 14% increase in that, something which will simply bankrupt local authorities if the government wasn't about to take those pressures off its books, but also pressures within departmental budgets, most noticeably on asylum accommodation and on the NHS. Now, on the asylum accommodation, the government had banked some savings from having less people in hotels, in fact, 0 people in hotels by the end of Parliament. Obviously, so far this year, the number of boat arrivals has gone up, as has the number of people in hotels, as I understand it. On the NHS, the government had recently negotiated a deal with the pharmaceutical industry, which showed the first significant increase in how much the NHS pays for drugs in quite a long time. And less than a year into that deal, it is going to be reopened. Again, these are spending pressures which the OBR has identified, but weren't reflected within additional government spending. So what the OBR has done is reflect those by, instead of expecting government departments to underspend their allocations, to think they're actually going to fully spend them over the next year.
Although, of course, I suppose the counter argument in terms of the pharmaceutical situation is how sustainable was it where we had a situation where pharmaceutical industries were essentially disinvesting or threatening to disinvest, and issues in terms of launching of new drugs. So that was a genuinely sort of challenging area. It still remains a genuinely challenging area. I suppose one other one, we're on the subject of genuinely challenging areas, from the perspective of the oil and gas industry, the windfall tax, one of those temporary taxes, still there. Quite a lot of concern about regulatory uncertainty. There's an interesting dynamic there in terms of the relationship between the oil and gas industry and government, and I think some work needs to be done to address that.
I mean, I think both these issues raise concerns where there's some things which are really easy for governments to target in the short run. And for many years in Treasury, I was just as guilty of this as everybody else. It seemed that the NHS was getting a dreadfully good deal on drug prices, which was uniquely amongst industries. The drugs that we get are developed for a world market, they're quality assured, that the price we pay has no impact on the quality of what we get. Under the current deal, it doesn't actually impact the volumes either. And we maybe lost sight of the fact that the life sciences sector is one of the 5 or 6 world-class industries that the UK has got, which operate in sectors where world demand is growing. And we need to nurture that investment. Now, governments for many years thought that if they could incentivize R&D and pipelines of talent for the industry, then it didn't really matter what prices were paid for drugs. And I think we've probably hit the limit of that thing, and recent discussions on trade deals with the US have brought that perhaps to further light. Similarly with the oil and gas industry, this is a windfall tax introduced during the energy price crisis on the basis that oil companies and gas companies were going to make an awful lot of money surely because of change in world demand. It's been extended now to 2030, which just goes to show that a temporary tax can become permanent very quickly. Just like on the other side of the strengths, that the fuel duties, which are supposed to rise in line with inflation every year, haven't actually increased in nominal terms since 2011. And the temporary tax cut, which was given by Rishi Sunak when oil prices were about 30 pence higher at the petrol pumps than they are now, has never yet been rescinded. Rachel Reeves said she was going to do something about that. Well, we'll see. So I think there's a general point here about it's very tempting for governments to do short-term raids, whether in terms of how much they spend or how much they tax on international industries, but they need to think about the long-term incentives. And if I'm an industry body, never believe the word temporary, because if you can do it once, it's tempting to come back.
Yeah, that's got to be true. Can I just turn to the local growth fund and what's going on there with more funding for mayoral authorities through that local growth fund, potentially unlocking some bespoke growth deals? That's going to be an interesting area for some of our listeners, I suspect.
I think it's very important. It's something that the UK has never cracked. If you look at the pattern of regional differentials across the UK over the last century, they haven't really shifted very much. And governments have tried various things, from regional development associations, from urban development corporations, to try and shift that. One of the things that I think national government finds very difficult, is because it's organised on departmental lines, it finds it quite challenging to broker deals which require regulatory or financial cooperation between different government departments. And that's something where a mayoral development authority focused on place rather than function can potentially make quite a lot of difference.
So, John, I'm conscious of time. We should wrap up. But any sort of final thoughts in terms of this budget as a whole, and in particular, the sense of, we've talked about some of the spending pressures. How credible is the spending plans that we're going to see in the final years of the scorecard period? Because it looks pretty tight just at the time we're having a general election.
Very much so. I think I would probably bring out 2 points in that. Rachel Reeves has increased her headroom, and she deserves a round of applause for that. It was politically challenging, and she's increased it from 10 billion to 22 billion at the moment of fiscal reckoning. That's still pretty low compared to, it's about 2/3 of the level of the average in the 2010s. So the chances of it being, I think the OBR said the government's got a 59% chance of hitting it. So it's better than 50-50, but not enormously more. So it will hopefully mean that very routine movements in the forecast will not lead to the sort of chaos and speculation that we've seen this year. But there would still be numerous examples of budgets over the last 15 years which would breach that. I think the second aspect is that really the central forecast for what borrowing is going to be in that year? I would notice that public spending is increasing during the spending review period. And then we get to the year of fiscal reckoning, year 29-30, the one that's outside of the spending review period. Rachel Reeves has posted in a 0% real terms increase. So that reduces the amount of borrowing by more than about £6 billion. If the government honoured its commitments to the NHS, international development and defence in that year, that would be looking at serious austerity level cuts in departmental spending for all of the departments. And those are departments which on average have spending per head about 20% lower in real terms than they were 15 years ago. So that doesn't sound too plausible for me. Secondly, about 3/4 of the tax rises, which are due to happen to sort out the fiscal situation, will kick in from April 2029 onwards. Now, what's interesting about that is that might be the year of a general election, and it doesn't seem particularly plausible that a chancellor will go into an election ramping up taxes, freezing spending in order to deliver that. I think it's worth saying that on average, in the third or fourth year of a fiscal forecast, spending increases by about 1% higher than it was forecast earlier. So yes, she's done a fiscal repair job. It's better, but the headroom is not particularly generous compared to the size of shocks. But secondly, it's very backloaded. It's very much like that St. Augustine prayer that, "Oh Lord, please make me virtuous, but not just yet."
Yeah, I think so. And that does suggest that, well, unless something turns up, and who knows, maybe we'll have an AI productivity surge or something, but unless something turns up, we're going to have some challenging budgets in the years ahead, and a government that's going to continue to be having to be careful when it comes to public spending and trying to find ways of improving efficiency. So that's all something that I think anyone dealing with government is going to have to take away from all of this. At that point, let us wrap up. John, thank you very much for your thoughts once again. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And you can find previous episodes where we've talked through fiscal events and many other things on the Negation website. And we'll no doubt be coming up with further negotiating with government podcasts in the future. Thanks for listening.